everyone, and welcome back to the Towards Data Science Podcast. And today we're talking about one of the biggest problems in AI, and that's out-of-distribution generalization. Now, during training, AIs will typically learn to make predictions based on features that are easy to learn but deceptive. Imagine, for example, an AI that's trained to identify cows in images. Now, ideally, we'd want it to learn to detect cows based on their shape and color, but what if the cow pictures we put in the training set always showed cows standing on grass? In that case, we have a spurious correlation between grass and cows, and our AI might learn to become a grass detector rather than a cow detector, which would be a much easier task for it to accomplish. Even worse, we could only realize that's happened once we've deployed our AI system in the real world and it runs into a cow that isn't standing on grass for the very first time. So how do you build AI systems that can learn robust general concepts that remain valid outside the context of their training data? That's the problem of out-of-distribution generalization, and it's a central part of the research agenda of Irina Rish, a core member of the Mila Quebec AI Research Institute and the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Autonomous AI. Irina's research explores many different strategies that aim to overcome the out-of-distribution problem, from empirical AI scaling efforts to more theoretical work, and she joined me today to talk about just that on this episode of the Towards Data Science Podcast. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think there's so much for us to talk about. Maybe one of the best places to start, I think, given the breadth of your interest, the breadth of your research, would be to explore a little bit the intersection of your research with safety and generalization. So I was trying to figure out, when I was doing research on you, looking at all the papers your labs put out, I was trying to figure out whether you'd consider yourself to be an AI safety researcher, an AI capabilities researcher, something in between, because it seems like you contribute to both. So I guess my first question would be, do you think it's meaningful to distinguish between the two? And if so, how would you describe your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question indeed. And I think AI alignment is a relatively new and rapidly evolving field. And we kind of realize more and more that things that we're working on while working on capabilities actually may relate to alignment as well. So historically, I was focusing on capabilities. So historically, I was kind of always working on topics like continual learning, out-of-distribution generalization, adversarial robustness, well, most recently, and so on and so forth. So I was also working on some neuro-inspired kind of approaches, like alternatives to backpropagation, for example, which may be more biologically plausible and hopefully also more computationally effective, and other type of classical capability kind of based approaches. But I would say that I'm kind of getting into alignment field. I'm very interested because I definitely realize, as people say, that with GPT-3, it was ResNet moment of alignment.
Right.
So pretty much now you are able to build AI systems that are highly capable without really understanding their behavior, without really understanding how can you affect this behavior and how you can steer this behavior. So it's a good time for alignment research indeed to flourish. So from the point of view, like as you asked whether I see myself as alignment researcher, I would say that what I was working on and continue working on is definitely related to AI safety, at least to one aspect. And as you know, the older paper that's an Anthropic website by Paul Christian and others about concrete problems in AI safety, right? One of them is precisely out-of-distribution generalization, or stability, robustness to distribution shifts. And I think it's no need to explain why it's related to safety, but classical examples are, you have some critical application in healthcare, you have system trained on X-rays to diagnose disorder, and it was unfortunately using some spuriously correlated features that have nothing to do with disorder and have everything to do with how those particular images were labeled in particular hospital. You can only imagine what happens if you take the system and start using it in another hospital, if it's based on spuriously correlated features. Another example, I mean, there are many examples like that, but actually you don't even have to go too fancy. Even stability to simpler things, not just like shifts in distribution, but I mean, just code, just like stability to the system parameters. I mean, if there are slight perturbations and something kind of goes wrong and the system stops working and makes incorrect prediction, and it's some, again, critical mission. Yeah, I mean, there are many examples like that. The oldest is not even related to out of distribution, but it's my favorite, about the famous failure of the spaceship because of some Fortran error. I don't remember details, but it's almost something like a semicolon instead of column. Talk about safety, right?
Right. Yeah, AI systems have to be so precisely engineered, so low entropy, so carefully crafted that like small perturbations cause complete like misalignment or complete
Unpredicted
disasters.
behaviors.
Right. Why is that the case? And why is out of distribution generalization so hard?
So historically, it was not the main focus of machine learning research. Like historically, for how many decades, and basically starting even from statistics, which is kind of the mother of machine learning, the goal was usually to achieve better performance, to have a better curve fit, if it's regression, or to have better generalization, and so on and so forth. The focus on robustness, and of course, there are areas in both statistics and optimization about kind of robust optimization and so on, but it was somehow not on the focus of machine learning research for a long time. Then people focused on developing highly performing deep networks, only to notice later that they're extremely fragile in terms of adversarial attacks. The famous examples of just adding kind of randomly looking kind of noise, like a pepper spray type of noise on top of a picture, which people will not even notice, can make system can actually break it completely, and it will completely misclassify the image. And then you don't even have to do anything adversarial. You start switching between, as I mentioned, this examples of medical imaging, or the proverbial cows on the beach and cows on the green pastures. When you try to learn classifier of an animal, and your deep net tends to pick shortcut features which are easier, but they are not true features of the concept. They are not shape, they are background. Just because it happens so, most of the images were on the green background for cows and yellow background for, say, camels. And then you move to cows on the beach, the system doesn't know what to do. So I think that was kind of noticed simultaneously in multiple areas of machine learning, and that triggered all the recent work on invariant risk minimization, the famous paper by Martin Arjowski and Leon Batu and colleagues from Facebook. And that paper triggered the whole line of research more recently on various other methods.
Could you dive into that actually? So invariant risk minimization, that was actually entirely new to me when I ran into it as I was going through your work. Could you explain the philosophy behind that? What's the basic idea there?
It dates back to like work in statistics earlier, and so-called invariance principle. And essentially, it's one of the ways of defining causality. Like if you have certain variables, they don't have to be the observed one, they're kind of hidden extracted variables, but if they exist and they essentially remain invariant, for example, shape, the shape features of the animal, they are invariant across multiple data sets, no matter what the background is. And they kind of causally define the type of animal. For example, they causally relate to that concept. While there are other features like background, which may be highly correlated, extremely predictive on each particular data set, but they are not stable or robust across multiple data sets. So this kind of principle of invariance led people to kind of ask a question like, how can we find features that are invariant, that are truly causally related to concept of interest? And the IRM paper was kind of among the first ones. So essentially the idea was, let's consider different data sets that we are training our classifier from. Let's not shuffle them. As Leon famously said, nature gives us data sequentially and doesn't shuffle them before training. So let's not shuffle data either. Let's consider environments and data sets as separate, so that we can formulate objective of robust predictor kind of learning, so that we say we would like to build, using deep network, for example, features or representations that are robust across all these environments, assuming that there is something invariant across them. So assuming, say, there are animals and we're trying to classify them. So let's try to extract such robust features that on top of them, we can have single classifier that is simultaneously optimal for all these data sets of the environment.
So just to make this concrete then, for people who aren't familiar with the concept, as I understand it, this involves, you gave this example of cows with the background. Most pictures of cows might have grass in the background because cows are usually there, but a cow is still a cow even if you move the cow into a desert or even if you have the cow indoors. And so when you collect data, sometimes you have a bunch of people who work, let's say, in an indoor cow farm or something because they're part of the cattle industry. And you might have trained on a bunch of pictures of cows in the pastures, but then at validation time or test time, you have a bunch of cows indoors and the classifier goes nuts because it got used to using the pasture as an input.
It kind of, there is this nice survey paper about their shortcut features, about propensity of deep learning algorithms to immediately jump onto easy shortcut features. Just like they give nice examples, like some lazy students, instead of really studying, they kind of memorize something and that helps them to pass a test, but it doesn't help them later on when the problems get more complicated. So it only gets them to the immediate goal and they may do it well, but when the kind of number of things they need to do broadens, that doesn't help. So the same may happen with deep networks, and we don't want them to be lazy students to jumping on those kind of shortcut features. We want to kind of steer them towards learning the true invariant properties, invariant mechanisms like physical or whatever laws that are actually in common to whatever data they're going to encounter.
And this seems almost intimately tied to the idea of overfitting. I guess I'm wondering whether, do you see it as being identical with overfitting, or is it like a little bit different from overfitting as a concept?
It is related. But it's still, I think it's still different. So overfitting potentially may happen even like without distribution shifts. So you may have some distribution of data and you keep kind of drawing from this distribution and test data also from that. But if you model in classical, of course, overfitting case, it's just when the number of samples was insufficient and the model number of parameters was too large. And important to note, model was not properly regularized, because that could be the key. The fact that you have small number of samples, large number of parameters, does not necessarily mean that you will kind of overfit. If you properly regularize, you won't, and there are many examples everywhere, including my own experience in, say, neuroscience, biology, brain imaging, where you have, say, few dozens of subjects and 80,000 parameters SVM or sparse regression, and yet it can generalize because of regularizers. So back to your question, out of distribution is a bit, it is related to overfitting in a sense to that distribution, but there might be different aspects of like what makes it overfit. So it's a good question. And by the way, talking about overfitting and talking about what can help learn models that regularize better, that generalize better. I mentioned regularization, and that was usually classical way of avoiding overfitting and classical way of potentially also steering model toward more robust ones, like regularizers of IRM, regularizers of invariant learning consistency, or ILC. It was another very hot kind of approach to this type of methods. Many others were proposed. There is whole domain bad benchmark, and our group, Jean-Christophe, actually extended it to Woods. We'll put it on archive, hopefully this week. Anyway, there are all these methods and they add regularization. But apparently, recently, as we've seen, the other way to maybe achieving better out of distribution generalization could be scaling. And I think that's something you also kind of mentioned briefly you would like to hear about.
Yeah, that would be great because scaling obviously is, I mean, it's exploded since GPT-3 kind of served as this big aha moment for the scaling argument. And yeah, I'd love to get your perspective, maybe first off on like, what is the importance of scaling, as you say, to generalization? And then maybe what do you see as the most important events in the history of scaling thus far?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, it's quite, on one hand, it's relatively recent work, but on the other hand, I mean, the whole idea of neural scaling laws is to kind of treat complex, quite complex artificial systems, like say neural net model, as in a sense natural, in the same way as you could treat natural kind of complex systems. That's why, well, every time a physicist take a good look at what's happening in machine learning, something interesting happens. So same with neural scaling laws, well, Jared Kaplan and others, his collaborators and so on. But anyway, there is a good history of physicists and particularly statistical physicists bringing very interesting perspectives into AI even before machine learning, like phase transitions and constraint satisfaction problems and approximate methods for inference and graphical models like Kikuchi approximations and so on and so forth. So with scaling, the story is, okay, so you have these complex models and you may increase the amount of data to feed them, you increase their size. It's hard to analyze how they're going to behave completely theoretically, although that's classical theoretical machine learning, but maybe you can do it empirically, and that's essentially what was done, especially in the context of GPT-3. So the interesting thing is that at this scale, you start seeing very beautiful laws, almost like the law of large numbers also appears at scale, right?
Right.
So when things are small, maybe you can analyze them theoretically. When things are medium, it's a mess. But then when they are sufficiently large, some laws emerge. And that was like really, really beautiful in a sense result. Basically the original GPT-3 paper and the follow-up papers by Jared Kaplan and his collaborators like OpenAI and his other friends, physicists. So basically, they noticed that there is a clear law, well, power law in that case, which looks like straight line in log-log plot, and that's probably many of you have seen so far, that this is quite a persistent phenomenon. In a nutshell, there are many type of curves because performance could be classification or it could be, say, cross-entropy laws on the test data. So this is kind of the first type of curves that were shown in the neural scaling laws for language models, neural scaling laws for autoregressive models, and then for transfer. And there is a whole now industry of neural scaling laws for X, where X is your favorite topic in machine learning. I'm basically just describing the first neural scaling laws paper, although to be honest, there were some previous papers in 2017 pointing in the same direction. And so in a sense, it's like a core discovery. And one step back, there is a more general actually picture. It's not just a scaling law in terms of straight line in log-log. The most general picture, if you think about performance like loss on test data, or perhaps classification error, or maybe not even test data, but some out of distribution data that come downstream, it varies, but most of the time you see kind of sigmoid-like curve. Initially, when you don't have enough data or the model is too small, your performance tends to be bad and kind of improve slowly. Again, it's very cartoonish thing, but it's a cartoon picture from 2017 paper from Baidu. And then at some point, there is like a tipping point and things start getting better more quickly. And that's exactly the part where the power law happened. That's a straight line in log-log plot part. And then eventually, when you have incredible amounts of data and model size, you may asymptote, you reach so-called irreducible entropy of the data. Basically, in classification setting, it would mean Bayes risk, like your model learns the best it can from data distribution, and due to inherent noise in the data or uncertainty in the data, there is no way you can do better than that, so on and so forth. So say you call it a reducible entropy for the case of the like unsupervised, just loss computing. So the sigmoid curve is kind of generic picture of what might happen. Of course, in some problems, you can get to that kind of the power law part faster. In some, maybe slower. It's still open area what exactly happens in every single situation for every type of downstream task, how it depends on data and how it depends on algorithm and how it depends on models. It's a whole area of research. But what was observed in the original Jared's paper was 3 famous plots. On x-axis, you have, say, increasing amount of compute, while allowing to choose whatever model size and whatever amount of data you need to perform best, taking that result, plotting performance in terms of cross entropy on test data, and realizing that you have straight line log-log plot, which you can fit to the data and infer your parameters for your power law. And it's actually being predictive about future behavior. Similar thing happens, although with different exponent and different constant for the increasing on the x-axis amount of data. And similar thing happens for increasing amount of models. So it's like a cartoonish description. There are more details, but I kind of really invite people to read Jared's papers, and they are kind of very clearly explaining and easy to read. So
no, I think it's a great primer on this. It also invites the question. I mean, the GPT-3 and scaling laws papers all addressed language models, and that's a kind of interesting aspect to this. So is there a special role that you see for language in the scaling story here, or is it just...
Not really. Language just happened to be the first. And GPT-3 was kind of, as I understand, those scaling laws were not just to analyze it, but actually to help build it. Because as I understand, those predictions on smaller kind of versions of GPT-3 indeed would hold in the future and kind of would help to determine which kind of algorithmic or architectural solutions to use so they will scale better, which is, by the way, the beauty of scaling laws and their usefulness for pretty much anything. And also the answer to all the skeptical people in academia who hear about scaling and their knee-jerk reaction is, but we cannot do it because we don't have that compute. You don't need large compute to do scaling laws because you are essentially studying trends with increasing amount of data compute and model size, or potentially other more nuanced aspects. And you can look at those trends to predict what would have happened if you had that compute. And that you can do anywhere, in academia, at home. So that's common misconception, by the way. And that is more like methodological approach to evaluating and comparing machine learning algorithms and architectures, which is, I think, very useful. And hopefully one day will replace our usual empirical sections with tables, where you take one benchmark of given size, one architecture of given size, and compare it with another one. And if you looked at the whole spectrum from small to medium to large, data, model size, and compute, you could see interesting trends you don't see in your tables. For example, classical visual transformer paper, right? The visual transformers at small data regime definitely are not as good as convolutional networks, but then the situation reverses. And you would like to see the trend. So back to your question about modality. Yeah, language was the first one. And there was, of course, a lot of that. But then, of course, we started seeing systems like CLIP, DALI. So they are multimodal. They combine images with text. Then we started seeing systems like Perceiver, UniPerceiver, Magma from Aleph Alpha. So you combine not just text and images, you can put videos, you can put audio, and you can keep going multimodal even further. So actually, I'm quite interested. We're trying to look into some time series. Well, I mean, it's in very initial stage, but we basically would like to do some time series foundation models for either healthcare applications, brain imaging, or like financial time series. Definitely of interest to our colleagues in Morgan Stanley. Yes. And then you can think about graph-based foundation models for drug design, for example.
Right. Yeah.
So you can have massively multimodal foundation models. I mean, it's very computationally expensive when it gets to more complex modalities. And of course, there is lots of talk about let's learn from all of YouTube, and then that will equal AGI. Yeah, learning from all of YouTube is a little bit challenging at this point, but I think it's a reasonable goal for future.
Well, actually, so that does make me think of something you mentioned earlier, which is, you do have this early phase where returns are very low, then you hit a scaling phase, and then there's that plateau region at the end. And one, I guess, interesting line of discussion might be what gets us to that plateau? What is the irreducible complexity of something like language, for example? And does multimodality help you get out of that some? Because I could imagine multimodality might help you transcend a limitation like that. If there's irreducible complexity in language, sure, but if you're also providing image data or video data, it kind of seems like that grounds
and audio potentially,
right.
I think so basically, if your goal is indeed it depends what is performance measure or metric. And by the way, that connects very well with alignment, because so far we were talking about more commonly used, say, cross entropy on test data, just how well you actually manage to capture the data distribution and represent it, right? If your question is more of a classification or some other type of, I don't know, you're trying to do reinforcement learning on top of those models, which is another recent hot topic.
Right.
Yes, many people looking into. Then the question is, if you indeed had multimodal representation of the same kind of concept, you have images and some text describing them, and maybe you hear sounds, then yeah, I agree with you that probably if your model is capable of exploiting all this information properly, it should be able to do much better than just language model or just image-based model. And in the sense that what we as people do, right, we fuse information from multiple sensors.
Yeah.
And that really helps. If you don't see something well, but you heard, I don't know, video was not quite good and blurry, but you heard something, that already kind of gives you maybe idea about what's going on. So if your goal is to figure out what's going on in a certain movie, you can still do that. And so on and so forth. So I think the multimodality, multiple sensors in human GPT is very important.
How much of a step towards AGI is scaling? Is there other stuff that's required? Because I know there's some people who see scaling as sufficient, and some.
I have such people in my group. I'm not gonna say who it is, but okay, yeah, we have those discussions every day. Well, I think even people who kind of claim that scale is all you need, they mean, of course, smart scale. Because of course you can probably try to scale just a single hidden layer MLP.
Right.
And technically, theoretically, that's a universal function approximator. That at certain scale, it should be, again, by the way, nobody really I think it's a good question just to formally investigate that the fact that it's a universal function approximator plus infinite scaling, what exactly would that imply statistically? But intuitively say, okay, you can scale that, it's probably going to perform well eventually too, but you probably don't want to do that, right?
Right.
You probably rather scale transformers, right? And you compare visual transformers with convnets, and you already see, as I mentioned, from the paper on visual transformers, that the trend is that at scale, you will have more basically you'll gain more if you use transformers and not convnets, which by the way also relates to the commonly mentioned idea of trying to get rid of unnecessary inductive biases.
Right.
Which may be too constraining, which is interesting question, because you also don't want to throw the baby with the water, because there are inductive biases and inductive biases. In a sense, everything you do is inductive bias. You use SGD, it's inductive bias. I don't know, but the point is, if there are unnecessarily specialized details and constraints that used to help us, with convnets, in the relatively low data regime. Just like with Bayesian inference, if you have good prior and not enough data, the prior helps you, inductive biases help you. But in the limit with more data, your prior should be washed out, right? And if you start with more uniform prior or less inductive biases, it might actually help you wash it out faster. But if you start with some very strong prior or inductive bias, which might not be too generalizable, that will kind of slow down your progress when you increase the data. That's why with inductive biases, like the classical bitter lesson, right? We've all heard about bitter lesson of Saturn, that you start AI with putting rules and expert systems that work before you start actually automating the learning process. You don't need those rules. You don't need human knowledge coded in. You become more autonomous. You have more general procedures such as search and learning, and they at scale work better. And the whole AI progresses in this direction. And every time you have some local success with human encoded knowledge, later on, it's outperformed by more generic algorithms at scale. So it's important to keep in mind so we don't waste time on something that's not gonna stand the test of time in the future.
But this is itself like a really interesting question, because looking back, as you say it, like classical machine learning arguably is just like nothing but a bunch of inductive priors. People go like, oh, I think a support vector machine makes a bunch of sense, or decision trees, you know, this is like a kind of process of human reasoning that we could codify. And then like we move to convnets, and what's striking to me about this is convolutional networks for vision. Intuitively, I think at the time, I genuinely felt like this was not a very strong inductive bias. Like, of course, images are translationally invariant. Of course, like, this is going to hold for all of time. And as you say, now we get image GPT, we get these transformers that work for images, and we're starting to learn that even that wasn't quite right.
It was apparently still constraining in a way.
Right.
So apparently there is a better way to learn.
And do we have a sense of what that constraint was doing? Like, what is it that like image GPT can do that like that ResNet 50 can't do through that lens? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess it is a good question. I think the intuitive thing about transformers, again, I'm kind of repeating, I guess, common opinion, whether it's language or images. The flexibility of transformers is that the attention mechanism, which by the way doesn't have to necessarily be implemented the way it is, but we'll not go into details. But the fact that you can have humongous sequence of tokens, which may be from your language, or they may be a tokenized image, or they could be tokenized any modality. But the point is, it can be extremely long. And if your attention generic approach kind of to choosing what's relevant is capable of finding kind of dependencies, like arbitrarily long range dependencies,
right,
that gives you that flexibility. And I think that's, in a sense, again, intuitively, just like hand wavy here with language, maybe that's what really pushed GPT-3 to the level of capability it has right now. Why does it sound most of the time more coherent than GPT-2 or alternatives? Because with transformers, first of all, they have the capability of capturing long-range dependencies, and that kind of relates to coherence of what you're saying. Plus, since you scale them and you scale the data, essentially you had both capacity of the probabilistic model that increased and can incorporate all patterns that are out there, and you had extremely rich data, diverse data that exhibit those corners of probabilistic space. So in that combination, and the combination of attention that helps you choose what is kind of connected with what, so, and goes, say, in convolutional network case, an image case, same thing. It goes beyond pre-specified dependencies. It goes longer range. I think that, I might be wrong, but that seems to be what is helping maybe to detect patterns that, say, convnets couldn't couldn't detect,
Yeah,
or other language models could not detect.
that makes intuitive sense to me, because like, or at least the way I'm thinking about it now, based on what you just described, is like, convolutional network, it can see the whole image in a sense, thanks to the stacking, but it doesn't prioritize attention, like making sure it checks, oh, this corner of the image and that corner of the image. You kind of lose and dilute that information as you move up the stack, whereas attention provides like this intelligent way of navigating that.
So if you think about human visual attention, so basically you have this mechanism called foveation, right? So basically your eye focuses at any given moment of time on just a few points in the image, and the rest is kind of blurry. I mean, there is, of course, lots of work on that and the work exploiting that in machine learning application. But if you look at the maps of kind of attention, like how the human eye traverses image, by the way, it really depends on multiple things. For example, there are famous experiments where you have same picture, different questions asked about the picture, and your trajectory is quite different. But the fact that you are able to pay attention to parts of the picture that can be far from each other, you don't just kind of perceive the local features. You really jump. Like, I don't know, the question is like, what do you think the social status of the person in the picture is? And you kind of look at like what the person is holding, what they're wearing, this and that, and who is around. You look at that attention kind of map of how your eyes jumps, and you see that, oh my gosh, it's like all over the place, and it just selected the most important things.
Well, it does make me wonder. I mean, do you think GPT or transformers in general are what's going to get us to AGI? I mean, like, is multimodal learning combined with transformers going to get us across the finish line? Or is there yet another revolution in architecture analogous to the one that brought us from convolutional nets to transformers in the first place? Is that yet in store for us? And are we going to have to get through that in order to really crack the nut?
My personal answer, again, it's all hypothesis. I still feel that, yes, we do need that potentially revolution. I know that Jared would say the opposite here, plus a few other people who were in our debates in the neural scaling laws workshops, and also we had 2 AGI debates at Mila last fall. I know it's highly debatable. I still feel that we may need more than transformers. I might be again wrong, but maybe it's my neuroscience kind of affinity talking, but I cannot help but notice the difference between neural net kind of nature and the human brain nature, or any biological network kind of nature. Perhaps again, it can be expressed in transformers. I'm not saying it cannot be, but I'd be curious to see. What I'm trying to say is the striking difference is you have biological network, even some worms that Michael Levine experiments with, and you probably have heard his talk at New Rips 2018, all the way to the brain. Why I'm bringing up worms, it doesn't necessarily have to be a neural network. It could be biological network based on bioelectric communication. It has memory and it has adaptation. Adaptation, obviously, to the environment, memory, because those whatever species develop certain shape. And the interesting thing, you can kind of reprogram them to develop, like, I don't know, 2-headed or 3-headed worms, like Michael Levine did. And all that is being done by changing the communication pattern between cells. And that is being done by chemical kind of interventions, changing some ion channels, opening, closing them. And once you change communication dynamic in that network, then, I don't know, the animals grow more heads, and that solution, not founded by evolution, is viable and reproducible. And that makes you think that seems like memory and adaptation is somewhere in the dynamics of those networks. And then we go all the way to the brains. And what does it mean when the brain is asleep and doesn't have any ImageNet images in front of it or any sentences fed to it? That dynamics never ceases. You have like never-ending communication, right. And the state of that dynamical system is extremely important in what type of output will be produced, not just the input. The input kind of modulates this dynamical system. But there are many opinions and books in neuroscience by, say, Georgi Buzaki, Brain Inside Out, that most of the information about the future state of the brain and outputs is not just in those inputs, but mainly like 90+% in that system. Right. And if you think about our transformers, well, they are not quite recurrent feedback systems with inherent spontaneous dynamics that is alive even without any input when they are sleeping. Mm-hmm. And there is a striking difference, and you cannot help but wonder maybe the richness of human brain functionality, or even those kind of simpler, more trivial biological network functionalities, is in that dynamics, in the fact that you use for encoding not just spatial kind of vectors, but you use time. And maybe we're missing out with artificial neural networks right now on that. I don't know. It might be the case, but it might be just like with multi-layer perceptron, that in principle, it's enough to have transformer to implement AGI, but there might be just much more efficient ways to do so with much better exponent, which leads us to good question. And for me, it's back to neural-inspired AI. Not the final solutions that evolution found, not particular areas of brain, but what was a process that scaled this network from single cell of amoeba through all these worms and other species to this. It's obviously a scaling process that could have better exponent, or like with animals like elephant or whale, which have larger brain, the exponent was apparently not so good in terms of their downstream task performance, right? So what are those principles of scaling and nature that maybe we could use?
That being forced to distinguish between the learning process, evolution, and then the artifacts that that learning process produces, like brains, as being two different things, because I think we're very tempted, it's very tempting to look at a human brain and say, oh, let's replicate this sort of shining example, this beacon of intelligence, and then you end up, I guess, encoding a bunch of inductive biases. If that's your attitude, if you're going to take a human brain and say, let's do it like this, maybe that does get you more off into inductive bias territory. I know Yen Nakaran just came up with his paper arguing for something like that. I guess would you call that like a central axis of the debate right now?
Okay. I think in a sense, just like in any debate, sometimes there is just difference in terminology. I think we all agree that whatever we call it is needed. So some information about how we build things, how we scale. But I guess what the bitter lesson is trying to tell us, and what I really agree, like the last sentence of that bitter lesson is essentially, you don't want to incorporate maybe two specific inductive biases that developed in the brain or whatever. You may want to incorporate still some, you can call it inductive bias, but rather the more generic process or procedure of getting there. So you want basically a higher level of automation. You don't want to tell system what the architecture should be. Maybe you wanted to develop it. Or basically what I'm trying to say, just by analogy, with massive search that could help you beat the human champion in chess, or self-play and Go, instead of specific rules of specific game. You kind of really want to get out of distribution more general, right, by not using specific or shortcut features that only work maybe for particular tasks, and in the short run can help you, but will not generalize eventually. You want to capture more invariant principles or mechanisms that can automatically lead you to better solutions. That it's not the very specific results like of evolution that we want to implement, just like it's not specific rules of the game that we want to implement, but rather, given that we will have scaling abilities and will have more compute, we want to let system develop those capabilities by only giving much more general, higher level procedural kind of algorithms like search or self-play and so on, rather than more specific kind of things.
I mean, it's intuitive, right? It's this almost management principle when you have a very powerful business behind you, very competent employees. You want to let them do as much of the thinking as possible and not be
Like you don't want to micromanage.
yeah, in a way, it's like it's the reason central planning fails, for example, or it's the reason that like you tend to want to see decentralization in large complex systems. The compute is just better used in that way, and if you don't put in too many inductive priors, your system tends to be a little less pathological, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah.
I
That's an
wonder,
interesting analogy indeed.
well, I wonder what this means as well for AI safety, because like one of my reactions when you mentioned this possibility of like we might have a new innovation that all of a sudden has a way better exponent, makes scaling work like crazy. I could imagine this leading to a pretty binary leap to something close to AGI in a context where our alignment research is all focused on GPT style, or sorry, I keep saying that, on transformer style models anyway, multimodal or otherwise on deep learning. If the paradigm shifts overnight and then we all of a sudden get really close to the finish line or cross it, does that introduce a new kind of risk? And do you think that there's room to think a bit more generally about what alignment looks like in that context?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The general concern is indeed that since the systems gaining capabilities so rapidly and they are so kind of large and complex that we cannot really kind of understand and control them, like what can we do to at least have, I don't know, better understanding of what type of capabilities they could develop, how that depends on scaling, and that safety, direct like notions of robustness, stability, and generalizability, and what can happen if it's kind of both capacity and capability and alignment safety related topic, right? Because you can say robustness is I don't know, capability. On the other hand, lack of it immediately leads to misalignment because system will not do anything close to what we want them to do and can be harmful if the diagnosis is critical, right? So, but this is just one example. And there are many other properties like that kind of paper, for example, on truthful Q&A, right? Basically looking into truthfulness of answers of GPT-3. Well, questions aside, how exactly you define your metrics for alignment, and that's a whole good question. But at least thinking that, okay, you can define many more different metrics and properties of the system that you're building, besides cross entropy on the test data, and besides classification accuracy. Those metrics from truthfulness to some other properties, depending on what you expect, can be also measured, and you can look at the scaling, and you can sometimes see what people say inverse scaling, like truthfulness was getting worse with scaling, in a sense, intuitively, clearly why, if you kind of garbage in, garbage out, if you show a system more kind of data with superstitions and kind of incorrect information, the system is simply a statistical model. So basically, it's neither good nor bad. It's just a statistical model.
Yeah.
But on top of that, of course, you could try to figure out, okay, so if you want, first of all, you can study how various properties of interest besides accuracy behave with scaling. Then you can ask the question like, and how do I steer the system towards those properties being what I want? And here are, I guess, again, multiple potential approaches. You can try to incorporate those properties into objective when you train the system, but you probably cannot, you cannot possibly think about all possible things that can go wrong and incorporate everything into objective. And also it feels kind of agreeing with people who wrote the famous book on the myth of objective, right? Why greatness cannot be planned, and perhaps things evolve in certain ways, and maybe you can see how changes in dynamics affect potentially behavior in the future. But it's a complex relationship.
Yeah, no, we actually, it's funny. We had Ken Stanley on the podcast as well earlier, and yeah, haven't spoken with Joel yet, but we'll have to. Yeah, you're absolutely right. it's just such a complicated area, and the debates in this are so multifaceted. I mean, in a way, I wish the stakes were a lot lower so that it could be just a fascinating intellectual exercise. But the fact that we're on the cusp, it seems, of making real breakthroughs in, human level intelligence, that sort of thing, really does drive home the importance of all this work. And it's great to see you're putting so much thought into it, and on the safety side as well. Yeah, Irina, thanks so much for joining me for this. It was a ton of fun.
Well, thank you so much.